A hot new investment that's giving a guaranteed 9.62% return? Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Stick around and we'll discuss I bonds, and I'll tell you whether or not I'm investing in them and whether or not you should consider investing in them. Hi, I'm Chloe, better known as clobaremoneycoach on the internet, and this is my channel where we talk about pretty much all things related to money. Now, you may have been hearing a little bit about this new investment called I bonds, and spoiler alert, it's not actually new, they've been around forever, but people are talking about them like crazy because inflation has not been this high in the last 40 years. With inflation at 40-year highs, that means these inflation-protected bonds are also going to be at all-time highs, but are they right for your portfolio? The answer isn't as clear-cut as the media may want you to believe, so let's talk about it in today's video. In today's video, I'm not only going to explain to you what I bonds are, but I'm also going to tell you why I'm not buying I bonds and who maybe should be considering I bonds and why you maybe wouldn't consider I bonds for your portfolio. We will get right to it, but before we do, be sure to hit like, be sure to hit subscribe. It helps my channel out a ton and it's completely free to you. And as a thanks to you for doing that, here's a picture of Logan to say thanks. In order to talk about I bonds, we gotta talk about bonds. Bonds are essentially like a loan, but instead of the bank loaning out money, you are the lender. So think of it as if you were buying a savings bond. You are giving money to an entity, whether a municipality, a government entity, or even a corporation. And the government entity or whoever you gave that money to is saying, hey, thanks for loaning us this money. As a thank you, we're going to give you a set amount of interest rate over a set period of time. Most bonds will literally pay you. That's why you'll often hear bonds referred to as fixed income investments. Now, how do they pay you? They pay you with what's called a coupon. And the coupon is that interest rate that you're going to be earning over a set period of time that gets paid back to you as a thanks for buying our bonds, thanks for loaning us this money. Kind of think about it like a mortgage. So if you had a mortgage, you're borrowing money from a bank, and in order to borrow that money, you have to pay the bank a set amount of interest rate over a set period of time until that mortgage is paid back in full. In this scenario with bonds and with I bonds, you are acting as the bank. So you're the one who's getting paid a set amount of interest rate over a set period of time. Now, over the last 100 years, bonds typically do not return as much money as your investments in the stocks area return, but they're considered relatively safe, especially if you are loaning money to the US government or municipalities. Now, the municipalities, it kind of depends on which municipality you're loaning money to, but government bonds are generally considered the safest bonds that you can invest in. I bonds are a certain type of government bond that is actually created and designed to help protect your money against inflation. The I in I bonds stands for inflation. Now, unlike regular bonds that we were talking about earlier, like regular government bonds or muni bonds, the interest rates that they are paying are not paid to you. So you're not going to receive that interest until you cash out your bonds. They put that interest back into the bonds. So instead, you see the value of your bond rising rather than getting those fixed income payments. But with inflation bonds, essentially the real return on inflation bonds is zero, because think about it this way. The only reason that inflation bonds or I bonds are paying you a 9.62% is because inflation right now is at 9.62%. So if our money is costing, or if things are costing us 9.62% more and you're only earning 9.62%, technically your real return is only zero, right? The entire purpose of I bonds is to help you protect a small amount of money, $10,000 or $15,000, depending on how you buy these bonds, against inflation. Now, there are some pros and cons when it comes to I bonds. The pros that I see of I bonds is that they can help you get a decent return right now on money that you're not planning on using within the next 1 to 5 years. Now, the reason I say 1 to 5 years is because in order to get the ultimate amount of return on your money, you have to keep that money invested in those I bonds for the full 5 years. With inflation at 9.62% this year, as well as the stock market down 20%, I can see why this would be a big appeal to folks. I mean, it's a guaranteed return. How often do you hear guaranteed return, especially when we're talking about almost 10%? That pretty much never happens. So if you've been panicking about inflation and you're trying to find a way to protect some of your money against inflation, I can see the appeal of I bonds, specifically I bonds right now that are giving you that guaranteed return of almost 10%. Now, unfortunately, I was trying to think of more pros to I bonds, but that's the only pro that I could think of. So let's talk about the long list of cons. Now, the first con that I see is that 9.62%, as I mentioned earlier, is really a 0% real return. Yes, you would be making 9.62% over the next 6 months, but in November 2022, that rate is going to reset. It could go up, it could go down, depending on what inflation is doing. So you're really only locking in that 9.62% guaranteed return for 6 months. In November, it could go down to 7 or it could go up to 11. Who knows what could happen? The other con that I see is that you can only invest $10,000 into these I bonds, and you can do an additional $5,000 a year if you have money from your tax return, which limits the people who are able to do that. As a US citizen, you can buy up to $10,000 of electronic I-bills on treasurydirect.gov, but then if you have a tax return, the government also allows you to buy an additional $5,000 of I-bonds, but paper I-bonds from Treasury Direct. Now, treasurydirect.gov is a website that you would expect from the government. It looks like it was made in the 90s, and it can be really clunky to work your way through, and from what I've heard from people who have actually bought I-bonds, it's a really confusing user experience. So I would add that to the list of cons of you have to buy them directly from the government. You can't go to Fidelity or Vanguard and buy I-bonds there. And then buying $5,000 of I-bonds with your tax return, but they're paper I-bonds, I don't even want to know how that process is. The other con that I see is that you are locking your money away for at least a year, so that automatically is removing the practicality of using I-bonds for things like an emergency fund or any short-term saving. Some of you, I am sure, are thinking, ooh, well, I could do I-bonds for my emergency fund, but that's really not the move you want to make because you're literally locking that money up away for a year. You cannot cash it out for at least a year, and really you shouldn't cash it out between a year and 5 years if you're trying to get the maximum return on these I-bonds. But the minimum is locking this away for 12 months, and then after 12 months, you are able to cash those out, but you will give up the last 3 months of interest. So keep that in mind. You won't get the full amount of interest if you decide to do that early. Because of that lack of liquidity, we really don't want to use those I-bonds for emergency funds or any short-term savings where we know we're going to need cash within the next 1 to 5 years. So what would I-bonds really be for? The final con that I see is that people who have this extra $10,000 of cash laying around are often missing out on an opportunity to buy in a bear market, which if you know anything about investing in a bear market, it's that's one of the best times to buy. Personally, if I had an extra $10,000 lying around, I would not be putting it into I-bonds right now. I would be putting it into the stock market. Because of this sexy guaranteed 9.62% return for the next 6 months, a lot of folks are forgetting about the stock market and running to get this return from I-bonds, when in reality that may not be the best move for their portfolio. But they're so excited by these headlines that are guaranteeing this income, and I think a lot of folks aren't fully understanding that you're not going to get 9.62% returns over the next several years. You're going to get it for a 6-month period, and that's going to change over the course of your ownership of I-bonds. And even if you were to put in that full $10,000, sure, you'll get 9.62% over the next 6 months, but keep in mind, 9.62% doesn't mean that you're making 10% every single month. That 9.6% is an annualized return, which means that if you were getting a 9.62% return over the next 12 months, then at the end of 12 months, that's when you get that full 9.62% return. So if you divide 9.62% divided by 12, that's really what you're getting on a monthly basis. So this idea that you're getting a monthly return of 10% is just not accurate, and I think that's just because folks don't understand how annualized interest rates work. We see that and we think, ooh, I could be making 10% every single month, and again, that's not how that works. 9.62%, what is that divided by 12? So your actual return, 9.62% divided by 12, you're really making about 0.8% every month for 6 months, which means you'd be making like $80 a month. So like for 6 months, you'd be making $80 a month. I mean, I guess that's okay. But then at the end of that 6 months, then the interest rate will change again. So you're not even getting an actual 10% return over this next year. It really depends on what's gonna happen in those next 6 months. And folks just assume that because it says a 9.62% annualized return, they're gonna get a 9.62% return. And that's not really the case. And I get it, it's confusing. They use confusing language to confuse you. And that's why I make content. So here's a reminder to subscribe and like. One of my favorite content creators, Money with Katie, did an entire episode on I-bonds, and I highly recommend you give it a listen, but her concern is one that I wanna echo. She's concerned that young investors, millennials, and Gen Zs are flocking to these I-bonds with their extra $10,000 of cash, and instead of putting it into the stock market like they probably should be doing, they're throwing it into these I-bonds, which really aren't going to give them long-term benefits. When you're in your 20s or 30s, $10,000 invested could make a huge difference over the long term, but that's when we're talking about investing it in the stock market, not into I-bonds. Think about it this way, if you were to invest $10,000 at the age of 30, which means you have 35 years left before you retire, and you were getting an average 8% annual return over the next 10 years, well, that would turn into almost $150,000 by the time you retire. Those rates with I-bonds, 9.62%, are likely not going to continue, and if they do continue, the only reason that they're continuing is because inflation is so high. Personally, I would rather put my money into the stock market, especially when we're in a bear market, and especially when I have 35 plus years before I plan on accessing that money. I have multiple videos showing you the power of how long-term investing can have on your wealth building journey, so be sure to check some of those out. I'll leave links down below. But those are generally the cons that I see, and you can tell based off of the one pro that I had that you're getting a guaranteed return and protecting your money against inflation. I guess that's 2 pros, to be fair. But with all of these cons, I'm not buying I-bonds. To me, it just does not make sense. Like I said, if I had $10,000 sitting around in cash, I would be throwing those bad boys into the S&P 500 without a doubt. I don't have that much use for I-bonds in my portfolio right now because I don't have any short-term or mid-term savings goals. So let's talk about who might actually benefit from using I-bonds. I kind of hinted at it already, so I feel like you probably know what I'm going to say. But the only real purpose that I see with I-bonds is using them for short or mid-term savings goals. So what are short or mid-term savings goals? Let's say you're planning on purchasing a house within the next 1 to 5 years. This could be an opportunity for you to put $10,000 a year into I-bonds in order to earn a little extra interest. Likely doing that is going to give you a little bit more return than if you were to put it into a high yield savings account, but as long as you're okay with locking that money up until you're ready to purchase that thing, whether it's a down payment, whether it's saving for a car, then I could see that totally making sense. But keep in mind, there is some planning required with that. If you're trying to get the ultimate amount of return for your money by using I-bonds and staggering it over the course of 5 years, remember that every new year that you're purchasing your I-bonds, you've got to wait a year before you can access that money. So you do want to plan accordingly so that you're not locking up money that you need. So I've also heard of people who are getting surgery in a couple of years or buying a car in a couple of years, and they're using I-bonds in order to get a higher return on those things. But keep in mind, the average returns of I-bonds over the last several decades have been closer to like 2%, not 9.62%. But generally, if you don't have any short-term or mid-term savings goals, I'm not sure really why you would use I-bonds. Instead, if you've got long-term savings goals, you need to be investing in the stock market. In my humble opinion, this is not financial advice. So I hope that gives you a little bit of perspective on like why I'm not buying I-bonds and I'm really not buying into the hype. But if you are buying I-bonds, tell me what you're using them for down in the comments below. I'd love to hear the other ways that people are using I-bonds. But if this helps sway you, or if you have questions, be sure to let me know that down in the comments as well. So I hope you guys learned something today, and if you did, let me know in the comments. As always, I am posting every day on Instagram and TikTok, so be sure to follow me there. And if you've made it this far, be sure to hit like, hit subscribe. It helps my channel out a lot, and I really appreciate it. But that's all I got for you today, so thanks for sticking around, and I hope you learned something new. See you guys next week.
Oh, my squishy Logan. Oh, my squishy Logan, you're so cute. It's so hot because we had to turn off the AC while we filmed a YouTube video, isn't it?